All right, welcome back. So today we're going to tackle a topic that pretty much everyone thinks they know, but trust me, there's a huge twist just hiding under the surface.
I mean, you've heard it a million times in movies and on TV, right? It's that classic line, you have the right to remain silent. It's practically burned into our collective memory as this absolute fundamental right.
But what if I told you it's not always that straightforward? That in some very specific situations, staying quiet could actually be used against you in court. Yeah, you heard that right, and that's exactly what we're going to unpack today.
Okay, so first things first, let's start with the basics. The general rule that protects an accused person. This is the foundation for what we all think we know about the right to silence.
So this all comes from Section 89 of the Evidence Act. You can think of this as the legal muscle behind that famous phrase. It basically says really clearly that in a criminal case, a court is not allowed to make a negative assumption, what they call an unfavorable inference, just because a person clammed up and refused to answer police questions.
But what exactly is an unfavorable inference? I mean, it's a bit of legal jargon, right? Well, the law breaks it down for us. It means the court can't look at your silence and go, aha, they must be guilty. That's what they call an inference of consciousness of guilt. And they also can't use it to say, well, this person isn't trustworthy, which would totally tank their credibility. The whole point is, your silence is supposed to be completely neutral.
Okay, but here's where we take a sharp turn, because we're about to get into a really surprising exception that exists in New South Wales. And in this case, silence is, well, it's definitely not always golden.
So check this out. On one hand, you've got that general rule we just covered. Your silence cannot be used to suggest you're guilty. Simple. But then, on the other hand, you have this very specific New South Wales exception, where, for really serious crimes, your silence sometimes can be. So how in the world does that even work?
The secret sauce here is a piece of law called Section 89A. This is what allows a court to make those unfavorable inferences we talked about. It kicks in when a defendant doesn't mention a certain fact when they're being questioned, but then later, in court, they try to use that exact same fact in their defense. You can kind of see the logic, right? The court is basically saying, hey, if this was so crucial to your defense, why are we only hearing about it now?
Now, this isn't some kind of free-for-all. The law puts up some really strict guardrails. This exception only kicks in for what are called serious indictable offenses. So we're talking about major crimes here. And it has to happen during an official police interview. Plus, the defendant has to be over 18 and fully capable of understanding what's going on. And maybe the most important rule of all, their silence can't be the only piece of evidence. There has to be other stuff pointing to their guilt.
So for this exception to even be on the table, the police have to follow a super specific procedure. You could almost think of it like a gauntlet they have to run, a checklist they have to tick off before your silence can ever be questioned.
And it all comes down to something called the special caution. The police have to give a very specific warning, and it goes something like this. It may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something you later rely on in court. Now, this is a huge deal because it's officially putting that person on notice that, hey, staying silent from here on out could have real consequences.
And it's not enough for the police to just say the magic words. The law is incredibly picky about how this is done. This special caution has to be given while the defendant's lawyer is literally right there in the room. And it can only happen after the defendant has had a chance to talk privately with that lawyer. If even one of those steps gets skipped, the whole thing is off the table. Game over for that exception. But let's say the police do everything by the book. They follow every single rule perfectly. Well, there is still one final, incredibly powerful safety net in the system, and that's the judge's ultimate power to make sure the trial is fair. This comes from Section 90 of the Evidence Act, and it's a really critical safeguard. It gives a judge the power to exclude evidence, in this case evidence about the defendant's silence, if they look at the whole situation and decide it would just be unfair to the defendant to allow it. This gives the court a huge amount of leeway to protect the accused person.
So, that leads to the big question, right? What does unfair actually look like in a real courtroom? What kind of situations would make a judge step in and say, nope, sorry, we're not allowing this evidence?
Well, we've got some great examples from past cases. A judge might decide it's unfair if the accused was especially vulnerable. Maybe they were really young, or had a below-average IQ, or were in a disturbed mental state. It could also be considered unfair if the police didn't play by the rules, like if they kept pushing for an interview after the person clearly said no. It really is all about protecting individuals and making sure the entire process is legitimate. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? It's that what seems like a really simple, straightforward right is actually this incredibly complex legal balancing act. On one side of the scale, you have a person's fundamental right not to incriminate themselves. And on the other, you have the very real need for police to be able to investigate serious crimes effectively. The law is always trying to find that perfect balance.
And that really leaves us with the million-dollar question at the heart of this whole thing. Does this system actually strike a fair balance? Is it giving enough weight to individual rights while still allowing for effective police work? You know, it's a debate that gets to the very core of our justice system, and it's definitely something worth thinking about.